What do tomatoes, birds, time, and smart cities have to do with each other? In their recent artwork, New Village from 2025, produced for the Korea Artist Prize at the Korean Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul, artist duo Unmaking Lab, made up of 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝗁𝘁 and Soo-yeon Song, generate a fever dream where all of these things swirl together to produce a surreal, speculative future present. Their home base of South Korea is a highly technological society, and for 10 years now, the duo has been collaborating on artworks and activism that explores the relationship between technology and society, following the trends of the ubiquitous, digitally networked city, including the Internet of Things, metaverse, and currently AI. As their name suggests, their goal is to unmake or reverse engineer, to learn through failure, and recover embedded knowledge through aesthetic experimentation. In doing so, the artists aim to critically observe the relationships between technology and society, which is often black-boxed or unnoticed within media spectacle. Importantly, in the words of art critic Won-Hwa-yoon, the creative act of making and unmaking, quote, is never a single final act. Rather, one object opens a latent space for other objects to emerge, and this consecutive emergence not only transforms the environment around us, but also changes self-cognition and expectations, end quote. As such, by looking closely and critiquing the world as it exists, Unmaking Lab's creative practice is itself generative of possibilities, exploring a latent space of information, culture, materials, and impacts. This talk introduces Unmaking Lab's Korea Artist Prize exhibition and theorizes how the artists critique the singular vision produced by the capitalist and extractive logic of smart city technologies, which now includes AI for visioning, urban planning, and monitoring. These tools are being embedded in society at a rapid pace, and by examining how artists engage with the tools, it may be possible to create resistance through digital literacy and speculative storytelling. Through a close reading of New Village, I'm going to explore how the artists are using media theory related to data and smart city imaginaries in order to challenge the colonial and extractive qualities of big data collection, as well as automated applications of data for urban development and future planning. Although I'll mainly be focusing on New Village because of its direct relevance to the issue of the smart city, the rest of Unmaking Lab's works within the Korea Artist Prize exhibition also utilize AI tools to mirror the relationships between society, culture, humans, and non-humans. Using self-trained algorithms, the artists scratch at the surface of the black box to understand how technologies function, and then utilize them to create alternative speculative futures that resist the unified vision of the technocrats who sell the tools. In one of their earliest works represented in the exhibition, Algorithmic Workers from 2018, the artists used text generators to create poetry trained on literature and oral histories from the 1980s labor movements in Korea, as well as interviews with game developers to draw attention to shifting labor economies in the Guro Digital Complex Neighborhood Redevelopment Project. In Fresh Stones from 2020, they collected rocks from a construction site and then used them to train a data set, increasing the size of the training data by breaking the stones and photographing them in different positions in order to trick the algorithm into understanding them as distinct. They expand on the story of the stones through the video The Sisyphean Variables from 2021, which formulates a surreal narrative of repetitive labor and human purpose. More videos like Ecologies for Non-Futures from 2023 takes the concept a step further, training datasets on animal trail cam footage, taxidermy, found images from the internet, and the StyleGAN generative AI model in order to show how algorithmic representations embed human assumptions and anthropocentric worldviews. For New Village, 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗿 and Soo-yeon highlight a real-life smart city development in Busan's river delta, which has branded itself as an eco-friendly future city for comfortable and convenient human living. While this project is not yet completed, it has thus far constructed a demo neighborhood that provides 5 years free rent to residents in exchange for their data. In 2020, a nationwide competition selected 54 households to participate in this new town, which is a common development term here in Korea, where a neighborhood is built from the ground up, usually after demolishing what was previously there, but in this case using infill to stabilize an unused tidal flat. The project is described as a living lab, which conducts research with citizen participation and experiences in mind, collecting data that will then theoretically inform the next stages of the development. The apartments feature smart environment controls, automated waste and recycling separation, health monitoring systems that are partnered with local medical and sports services, robotic deliveries, and even a smart community farm facility to grow salad vegetables. This all seems pleasant enough. After all, who wouldn't want a smoother, more convenient, more comfortable place to live? A place that seems to anticipate your needs before you're even aware of them. Yet, as 𝗔𝗀𝘁𝗁𝘁 and 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁𝘁 point out, the smartness mandate is one that is tied to neoliberalism, that leverages fears of instability and unpredictability in order to transform the cityscape under the rubric of efficiency and order. Smart city technology distributes agency into objects, networks, and individuals rather than traditional collective governance, creating a reasoning and self-moderating ecosystem for us to live in. The technologies are often focused on solving problems in real time, adapting to the current moment in order to shape a safer, optimized, more predictable future that also treats users as a unified mass based on popularity, trends, and averages of big data. Since algorithmic decisions take place on a code level, which government rarely has the capacity to affect or understand, there's a danger that future visioning becomes dangerously consolidated in the hands of technology designers and private businesses, rather than the communities that should be playing a strong role in municipal government. Furthermore, 𝗔𝗀𝘁𝗁𝘁 and 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁𝘁 point out that the smartness mandate also propagates the capitalist and technocratic process of beta testing and planned obsolescence, which constantly updates in the guise of fixing bugs or adding new features, where a final solution is always postponed into a never-arriving future. This conveniently also hooks municipalities into a closed, proprietary ecosystem that constantly feeds money back to private business for maintenance and management, while also locking out new competitors. Unmaking Lab critiques these processes through deep exploration of the aesthetics of generative AI. This technology approximates human creation through what is called latent space, an algorithmic realm populated by data. Within this system, visual or textual output is created through patterns of similarity that populate an enormous range of possibilities. Although generative systems can navigate latent space in a seemingly infinite number of ways, it's crucial to recognize that the same datasets that structure possibilities also limit them. Datasets embed bias, but also naturally create what artist Hito Steyerl describes as mean images, that is, statistical averages that suppress difference. Unmaking Lab proposes that smart city tools, particularly those being driven by automated decision-making processes, may ultimately construct something like a non-future, where technology seems predicated on future-oriented processes, but ultimately only recycle the same materials of its limited dataset. The artists explain that, quote, smart cities seem to represent a state in which the technological potential of the future has been overextended. In contrast to real cities, which are messy, layered, and filled with uncontainable complexity, smart cities strike us as overly flat and uniform in their interpretation of urban life. They may be smart, but they often lack any thoughtful approach to relationships or lived experience. They rely on data extraction to imagine singular, excessive futures and provide visions that feel closed and predetermined, end quote. This sense of hollowness about the promise of the smart cities seems to be echoed in the lived experiences of places like Songdo, Sejong, and Busan Eco-Delta. Although public writing about the results of the trial is still emerging, as residents moved into the site in 2021, an article for Korea's JoongAng Daily quotes a student resident describing how, quote, the biggest difference that I feel now is that I don't have to get up from the bed when I want to turn the light off at night, end quote. A quote that sets the stage nicely for Unmaking Lab's tongue-in-cheek exploration of the smart city experience. For Unmaking Lab, the latent space of generative AI becomes useful because through artistic means they can both visualize the limited imaginary contained within the algorithm, while also probing what kinds of latent futures have not yet been visualized. Through training, prompting, and generation, the artist can unmake average visions of the future in order to discover things, beings, histories, ideas, and cultures that have been lost, ignored, or invisible. Through surreal and humorous imagery, Unmaking Lab found ways to rupture the non-future of both AI and the smart city. In New Village, Unmaking Lab allegorizes the extractive future visioning of techno-capitalism by collapsing the story of the smart city with that of a special variant of tomato that is grown in the same area that's been planned for the development. This Woosong 𝗔𝗀𝘀𝘁𝗿 tomato gains a salty sweet flavor from the brackish soil conditions of the 𝗔𝗯𝘀𝘁𝗁𝘁 River estuary that mingles with the salt water of the South Sea. Commercial farming of this plant began in the 1950s after the Korean War, and it's since gained fame in Korea for its unusual flavor. The unique environmental conditions means that it cannot grow anywhere else. Poignantly, the tomato is not actually native to Korea. It originates in the Americas. They were first mentioned in Korea around 1614, but they didn't really become popular until Japanese colonization, which brought a number of foreign influences into the Hermit Kingdom. As such, the 𝗔𝗀𝘀𝘁𝗁𝘁 tomato then represents a foreign influence which has been shaped into something entirely new and uniquely Korean by the conditions of environment, history, and society. The tomato is actually a recurring theme in Unmaking Lab's work, utilized in Fresh Stones and the Utopian Extraction lecture performance, both of those from 2020, where they further interrogate the Sisyphean labor mentioned previously by pouring ketchup onto rocks in order to disrupt machine recognition processes. Discussing the more recent Ecology for Non-Futures project from 2023, where they trained datasets to generate wild animals using taxidermy and pre-existing generative AI datasets, the artists also mention an interesting discovery that they made when they visited the taxidermy collection of the National Museum of Science. This collection includes a number of taxidermy tigers, an animal that was once seen as the symbol of the Korean Empire, but that was driven to extinction by trophy hunters during Japanese occupation. In one account, Japanese officials served tiger at tasting sessions held in Seoul and Tokyo, displaying a taxidermied animal and then serving the meat with a tomato ketchup marinade. Although it's unlikely that the artists were aware of this when they first started to use ketchup and tomatoes in their work, these kinds of tangents and resonances are important as they tangle with the visions and priorities that are similarly embedded in the projects of imperialism, capitalism, and smart cities. The film of New Village opens on the computational aesthetic of a blue screen of death, glowing with pink backlighting in the dim space of the white cube. The artists explain that the delta is accumulating data instead of silt, and then a digitally rendered cityscape falls from the sky, plopping carelessly into the scene. These images are 3D models that have the barest sense of illusion, with flat, 2D photos pasted across the surfaces that are clearly voids inside. People are also rendered in an awkward, cartoony 3D, seeming like broken facades of humans that are not quite scaled in the right dimensions. The aesthetic of the digital, and particularly AI, is foregrounded here. This look is something that artist Niels Spuker described as fluffy glamour glow, but it's often a slick kind of aesthetic comprised of saturated colors, perfectly even textures, sharp cartoony edges that separate the figure from the ground, and which move slightly wrong. In a 2023 interview with me, Bina Choi articulated her impressions of the famous Songdo smart city near Seoul, where she explains that it felt like game assets that had been dropped from the sky. In this real-life SimCity, she observes that the texture of the city space is flat, depthless, and inhuman, creating a feeling of walking on a treadmill through a repeating landscape. Here, her impression of the in-real-life Korean smart city is aestheticized in a metaverse-style scenography, collapsing real space and virtual space in the same way that's proposed by the smart city. Over the course of 24 minutes, the artists conflate photographs of the Busan Eco-Delta development with their fictional Canary Village, where living creatures are test subjects and visible markers for when things go wrong. The special tomatoes are the foundation for a neural net that runs the smart city. In this landscape, cartoon-like resident characters and tomatoes resemble each other, happy and perfect, plastic on the surface and hollow inside. The tomato neural net learns about time, nourishing and ripening the tomatoes for market through fear, labor, and anger. The doubling of real images and artificially generated ones continues, clearing away the real and replacing it with representation. At one point, the viewer learns how to make ketchup, presumably from the tomatoes that are being farmed by the system. But then instead, we see the product made out of self-referential artificial means, where ketchup is laid out to dry into powder and then rehydrated again. Eventually, an abnormal blue tomato reveals a temporal instability that indicates that the plant is soon to ripen, and therefore culminate in its final marketable form. This blue tomato ends up making people sick, hijacking the neural network and causing dreams of a catastrophic city. The tomato neural network decides to stay unripe. In New Village, we see a flattened, dimensionless future. The aesthetic of the AI and digital visuals create a smoothness that lacks the textures, flaws, and depth of space that's found in reality, while depictions of people in the film seem to draw on the perfect, eerie happiness of 1950s nostalgia, where housewives, husbands, and children all play their structured roles in order to achieve the promise of the American dream. Characters move stiltedly, with pasted smiles on their faces, grins that stretch into grimaces. Here, the aesthetics visualize the shallow inner life of the New Village residents, who act more as advertisements for the development than they do actual human beings with wants, desires, and thoughts of their own. At one point, the characters are encouraged to throw tomatoes as a game, with a warning that the game is to throw, not to start a revolution, in a gesture that co-opts the culture of activism in order to propagate the smart city. This echoes the reality of smart city developments where community consultation and branding sometimes generate a facade of humanism that's leveraged towards corporate development goals. For instance, media theorist Shannon Mattern describes how Sidewalk Labs Toronto branded itself as a post-it city that aestheticized public engagement. Through handwritten feedback and interactive demonstrations featuring humble materials of concrete, particle board, foam, and post-it notes, the project communicated to the public using, quote, rhetorical tools suggesting that here, cities are workshopped, end quote. The exploration of time is also important here, with the world of the film featuring a collapsed dimensionless time that exists in a kind of non-space, non-time, non-future. There's no specificity to the temporality or connection of the past, present, and future. It's all the same. This is a common feature to the smart city imaginary, which depicts a utopic, frictionless future that's smoothed by technology and inhabited by generic, happy people who smoothly go about their productive lives, working and playing in spaces where public, private, home, and office are all collapsed for maximum efficiency. Halpern, Mitchell, and Gagan explain that, quote, smartness colonizes space through the management of time, end quote, imagining the fast and probably linear flow of data, traffic, humans, goods, and services against the constant warning of the crisis that faces us without the technology. That is a future that's unpredictable, circular, and meandering, and features uncontrollable problems like climate change, social conflict, and failing economies. Much better to focus on individual convenience and efficiencies, like being able to turn off the lights without standing up. As such, the smart city attempts to minimize the distances between user needs and actions that solve their immediate problems. This instantaneity is contingent on real-time data, which again focuses attention on the current moment rather than the past or the present. Legal scholar Carolyn Compton points to the use of data technologies to address disaster response, particularly related to climate change. She notes that disaster response necessarily focuses on the immediate need of saving lives, but that the implementation of big data continues to reinforce this crisis mode of immediate response, rather than trying to visualize change or problem solving on the bigger temporal scale necessary to adapt to the unpredictability of climate change. The prediction machine of the smart city operates on a similar scope, fixing problems of garbage disposal, heavy traffic, or climate control, rather than taking the multi-decade or even multi-generational scope. Compton argues that this fixation on the present makes it difficult to imagine more diverse future possibilities. And we can see Unmaking Labs similarly depicting a kind of flattened time that is manipulated by the tomato smart city neural network to fulfill its purpose, that is, to ripen. And then comes the tipping point, where the temporal instability manifests the blue tomato that sickens the residents and causes the network to dream of a catastrophic city. After that, the tomato neural network city chooses to subvert its own system by refusing to ripen. Architect Omar Khan points to the hazard of pervasive media undermining who is in control of the built world. He writes that, quote, interactivity puts control into play as something to be negotiated, end quote, which can create positive new relationships between humans and the built environment. For Khan, automating tasks doesn't necessarily preclude human participation. Observing and monitoring are still actions. However, there is also a danger of delegating responsibility to an object. He explains that smart environments create a kind of guilty pleasure where, quote, they forecast solutions for pressing problems of climate change and sustainable energy without requiring any substantial activity from us. We won't need to curb our own consumption nor examine the way that we do things, since our sentient buildings will manage the problem. More importantly, they will handle our guilt by hiding the responsibility from us. End quote. As such, smart systems seem to solve problems of the immediate crisis while deferring long-term thinking and problem-solving into the distant future. Furthermore, they also take on the responsibility, so no one needs to be in trouble for bad actions or behavior because the system will just automatically clean up the mess. And really, who can blame us? The problems we've created seem so big that they're impossible to fix. Much easier to be comfortable and happy in the current moment, to solve the small problems that can be solved. Yet, through their artwork, Bina Choi and Suyeon Song try to make visible some of the problems that we are newly created with our technological solutionism, particularly the homogenization of human imagination and visual culture, which then affects the world that we build around us. Like Sisyphus, they pick up the detritus of digital culture and laboriously examine it over and over again. Through their process of making with the digital tools of the smart city, AI, IoT, big data, they develop an ambivalent understanding of these tools and systems, while attempting to find cracks and footholds for producing new possibilities for the future, rather than just reproducing old ways of being.